34 slides and about 20 minutes. Get down to business. I first put my project in its disciplinary or theoretical framework, which is that of historical neo-institutional economics. I'm a lawyer, an historian, part-time economist. I'm not a sociologist. So I'll comment within this framework about the position of my project. So in the early stage, the early generation of institutional economists, Douglas North, for example, and others, were interested in the early 70s in the way in which institutions influenced economic performance. Second stage in institutional economists was interested in the way in which the economy shaped institutions, and the focus was then on the way in which expanding markets, new technologies have shaped institutions. Yes, later on, they started to integrate additional factors, which I termed the environment in general, but it was particularly political factors that were integrated, political economy, interest groups that were integrated into the theoretical framework and the actual historical researches. And then there was the sense of feedback loops, or interactions between the environment and the institutions. More recently, comparative studies did emerge, and there are quite many of them. I mean, one of Arnold Greif has interesting comparison between Italy and North Africa. Timur Kuran has interesting comparisons. Law and economics scholars such as Mark Rowe have such comparative projects. What I'm trying to do is to move one step forward with some others, not by myself, and try to integrate into this framework the influence of different environments and different institutions on each other. I'm more interested in the way in which institutions actually migrate and are being transplanted from one environment to the other. I think that this is one of the missing factors in this analytical framework. And how did I get to this? I initially worked on the English East India Company, trying to figure out how it was shaped in its very early years, around 1600, the connection between the environment, the political, social, market environment, and the design of the English East India Company. I then came to realize that there were sharp differences between the structure of the English company and the Dutch East India Company, that was formed just 2 years later, and that part of the explanation for these differences can be found in the environment, the different political environment, the different market environment of the Dutch Republic and England at the period. And then when I was invited by Timur Kuran to participate in this conference, he asked me to work on other civilizations and pushed me into working on the WAC. I didn't work on the WAC, but the WAC was a good lead for me to think about transplantations, migration of institutions. So this is my third project in line, the one that focuses on migration and transplantation. What? Okay, to be closer to the mic. Okay. So what I'm trying to do is to identify migration of institutions in between 4 major civilizations that were involved in Eurasian trade: Chinese, Indian, Arab, and Western European. There are some other groups that were involved, some other regions that were involved in this trade. I'm not working on them at this moment. And I'm also focusing only on oceanic trade. That is, the overland caravan trade, the Silk Route, offers fascinating stories, raises interesting institutional questions. At this point, I did not touch this. Basically, all 4 civilizations traded with more or less the same regions. These are the trade routes, the oceanic Indian Ocean trade routes of Arab civilization, stretching from the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf all the way to China. Indian civilization, more or less the same. Chinese civilization had more frequent contacts with Indonesia and India, but at some point the Chinese also arrived at the eastern coast of Africa, and the Europeans were the last to arrive. They first arrived through the end ports of the Silk Road. Later on, they circled the Cape of Good Hope, starting shortly after 1500, and became also involved in this in trade within the same route. So what we can see is four different civilizations trading in similar routes, trading in quite similar goods. They had to deal with the same ocean, the same monsoon regime, the same quite similar geopolitical environment, with a problem of long turnover time, longer for Europeans than the rest, but quite long for the rest as well, because of the monsoon. International trade had the problem of third-party enforcement. They traded with more or less the same goods going east and west. They had the problems, high investment threshold and high risks, both monsoon, pirates, and some other risks. And these are the goods that they were trading with. So I was trying to understand how these different civilizations, doing more or less the same business activities, how did they organize their trade? And they organized their trade in a variety of models, a variety of forms, stretching in my conceptual. How can I do it? I want to get closer to the slide, but I can use. I'm not well trained in this, but I can stretching all the way from the individual peddler carrying his own goods literally on his back, getting on ships and traveling from one port to another, all the way to the highly complex state organizations of the Portuguese, the Chinese, and some of the others. I came to the conclusion that working around the middle of the continuum might be more interesting in terms of trying to figure out which institutions do migrate, which institutions can be transplanted from one civilization to the other. And I mean, as you can see, my continuum is stretching from more complex institutions to simpler ones, from ones that are more embedded in civilization to one that might be more universal in the basic features, and from ones that I kind of predicted that will not migrate well to ones that will migrate more easily, from one that are not well receptive to economic analysis at its current theoretical stage, to institutional frameworks that can be better dealt with by economic theory. So the research questions are, the more general questions are in the top, the more specific ones in larger font in the bottom. Did the civilizations involved in Eurasian trade use similar or different institutions? As much as they did use similar institutions, was this because each of them reached indigenously similar? Did they evolve similar institutions indigenously or independently, or did they import, transplant institutions from other civilizations? And if they did not adopt similar institutions, did not evolve them indigenously, why didn't they? When options were in existence in other civilizations, why weren't they adopted by some other civilizations that could be exposed to them and could theoretically import them? And the focus is on the institutions around the center of the continuum I just presented in the previous slide, that is the Commenda and the corporation. And in a way, both of them could theoretically be either migrate or be indigenously evolved, and I was trying to figure out whether they actually develop locally or migrate, and I thought that by looking at the center of the continuum, I might be able to get more valuable insights. So I'll say a little bit about the Commenda because this is the less familiar form of the two. The corporation is quite familiar because it's still in use in modern time. Basically, the Commenda is a contract or a partnership between an investing partner and a traveling partner. The investing partner puts in capital, the traveling partner puts in labor, and we both form the Commenda capital, which is a separate pool of assets. And now the traveling partner is actually conducting the business transactions for the Commenda. He is dealing with third parties in overseas destinations. Whatever he's making in these deals by selling goods overseas is considered to be part of the Commenda capital. If he incurs any liabilities, the liabilities can be the liabilities of the Commenda. If he violates his agency contract with investing partner, that is, if he violates the common practices of commerce at the time, he can also be personally liable for any losses. And at the end of the life of the Commenda is a one venture, one shot contract. At the end of the life of the Commenda, profits are being split between the two parties on a 75 to 25 proportion, if there are such profits. There are some variations to the Commenda. What's most important, I think, is to understand that the single Commenda is part of a network of contracts in which many merchants are involved. Often one investor invests in a multiple Commenda. One traveling partner can take the money of various investors and travel with that money of a variety of investors. So this is quite a complex institution. It's a nexus of contracts that includes investment contract, agency contract, allocation of risk, allocation of profits, creation of a separate pool of assets. It requires third-party enforcement. It requires quite a dense set of legal rules to control the relationship between the two parties. Now, when we look at the migration of the Commenda, we see that it's quite clear that the Commenda originated in Arab trade, in Muslim, in Islamic law, no later than the 8th century. And then it migrated from the Mediterranean in both East and West with Muslim and Jewish traders to India, and from India then to Indonesia and China. It traveled west as well to Venice, Genoa, Spain, Germany, England, and beyond. We can see it in a more graphic way, going all the way to Indonesia, both via India and via the Western traders that did arrive. The Portuguese and the Dutch used Commendas in the early trade with Indonesia and then on to China. The corporation has different origins than the Commenda. Its origin is in Europe, not in the Middle East. Probably not in Roman law, though some of the literature indicates that it did origin in 1st to 3rd century AD. It probably did origin in medieval times, 12th to 14th century. The sources for its origin are being debated in the literature. Reinterpretation of Roman law according to one view, canon law origins according to another view, Germanic customs according to a third view. The corporation diffused in Europe between one context and another. It did not diffuse beyond Europe, but in Europe it did diffuse from high scholarship into public and semi-public corporations, religious, municipal, educational, into for-profit organizations such as the guilds and the regulated corporations, and then into joint stock corporations that were involved in Eurasian trade, first through the overland, by trading with the end ports of the overland routes, the Russia Company that was established in 1553, the Levant Company, then around the Cape of Good Hope, reaching Asia around 1600, first the English East India Company, then the Dutch East India Company, and a couple of centuries later, French, Portuguese, Danish, and some other European corporations did trade with the Indian Ocean. Whereas the regulated corporation was quite similar to the guild in the sense that each individual member was trading on his own risk, that is, trading in a capital he actually accumulated or taking risks, bearing losses. The joint stock corporation that was introduced around 1600 was a radically different institution in that it traded in its joint stock that was pulled together from various shareholders and was put to business as a joint stock. I think that there is not much debate in the literature about the fact that corporations did dominate European trade with Asia, and they became dominant in Eurasian trade in general within a short period of time. I mean, there are some versions to some explanations to this. Stinsgaard, within the Weberian tradition that was mentioned earlier, views the corporations as internalizing military and political costs, not put emphasis on the saving in economizing in transaction cost and as a risk spreading mechanism. Carlos and Nicholas and others view the corporations as efficient mergers between various stages in the trade rather than moving the goods from one port to another, from one point to another. The same corporation did it all the way from Indonesia to the markets in London or Amsterdam. And again, this is an efficient institution in the sense of using economy of scale, having better flows of information than other institutions. So, why did corporations emerge only in Europe and not in other civilizations? I rule out the first two explanations. I mean, there were juristic learned traditions, not only in Europe, but in other civilizations. The Germanic fellowship tradition contradicts many of the other arguments because it relies on a more communal conception of European society. The explanations that I find more attractive or more persuasive are the ones that emphasize the Catholic Church as the place or as the context in which corporations did develop, explanations that put emphasis on the unique social structure of Europe, nuclear families as opposed to extended families in other places, and on the kind of medieval institutions that some of which were uniquely European, which created demand for some sorts of informal legal institutions that would allow the management of cities, universities, guilds, and particularly churches. So what we can see is that the church feature in all three explanations that I find more persuasive. Why didn't non-European civilizations adopt the corporation? I can rule out the first explanation that religious or legal conservatism kind of objected the importation of this institution or the local evolvement of such an institution. Non-European civilizations had extended families, had stronger communal ties that made the corporation redundant. Extended families could serve many of the functions that in Europe had to be served by the corporation without a resort to corporations. There were in these civilizations other formal institutions, the WACS, the SVERNI, the Family Lineage Organization or Family Lineage Trust, that substituted some of the functions performed by the corporation in Europe, particularly when it came to public, semi-public, and family functions. And the non-Europeans were quite successful in the Eurasian trade until the 17th century. The state on the one hand, the individual merchant on the other, and in between the Commenda and some other loan contracts fulfilled the apparent gap that wasn't actually there by the absence of the corporation. And also because they were geographically more advantaged in their location. They had easier access to the Indian Ocean. The Europeans had to go around the Cape of Good Hope, which meant that they had to invest in longer voyages, in larger ships, and things like this. Why did the Commenda migrate better than the corporation? Not only because it was less complex, because it originated, I think, in trade practices and not in religion, because it arrived earlier, it was introduced earlier, its place of origin was more central, it was carried by Muslim merchants and by the expansion of Islam, and the Commenda could rely on the different types of interactions between civilizations that existed in the Indian Ocean. This is the expansion of Islam. We can see that Islam arrives in India, in Malacca, in Malaya and Indonesia. We can also identify, and I'll use this again, some kind of crucial points of interaction. Malacca is the most famous of them. Others include Aden, Hormuz, where institutional knowledge could be passed from one civilization to the other. And to conclude, I don't have to recap, I think. What I am trying to argue, I guess, is that the migration and translation of institutions are something worth studying. I don't claim that my explanations are kind of conclusive. They are still speculative and tentative, but they are worth discussing. And maybe I'll stop here. Yeah.